You're a servant in the Swedish royal palace on a cold February evening in 1771. The sound of laughter echoes from the dining hall as King Adolf Frederick celebrates Fat Tuesday with his usual gluttony. You've seen him feast before, but tonight feels different, more desperate, more excessive. The smell of roasted duck and champagne fills the corridors as you carry in the 14th serving of semla, those cream-filled pastries he craves. What you don't know is that in 3 hours the king will be dead, and what killed him wasn't poison, wasn't politics, wasn't war, it was his own appetite. This isn't folklore or legend. The royal autopsy records still exist, chronicled by witnesses documented in diaries. Once you see what happened that night, you'll understand why gluttony was always considered a deadly sin. Born on May 14th, 1710, at Gottorp Castle in Holstein, Adolf Frederick entered a world designed for mediocrity. His father, Christian August of Holstein-Gottorp, was a younger son with limited prospects, while his mother descended from Swedish royalty, a bloodline that would prove both blessing and curse. As a child, Adolf Frederick learned that survival meant accepting whatever scraps of power others offered. He became Prince Bishop of Lübeck at just 16, a ceremonial role that taught him the art of appearing important while wielding no real authority. By his 30s, he was administrating territories for underage dukes, always the caretaker, never the master. The twist came in 1741 when Empress Elizabeth of Russia crushed Sweden in war. Threatening to annex Finland permanently, she demanded something unprecedented. Sweden must elect Adolf Frederick as heir to their throne. Not because of his talents or bloodline, but because he would be Russia's puppet. The Swedish parliament, desperate to keep their eastern territories, agreed to this humiliation. In 1751, when King Frederick I died, Adolf Frederick inherited a throne stripped of its power. The Swedish parliament controlled everything: finances, foreign policy, even who the king could marry. He was quite literally a prisoner in a crown, a constitutional monarch reduced to cutting ceremonies and signing documents he couldn't read beforehand. But there was one realm where Adolf Frederick remained absolute master: the dining hall. While politicians debated Sweden's future, the king found solace in elaborate feasts, exotic delicacies, and especially those cream-filled pastries called semla. Food became his kingdom, appetite his only uncontested authority. And by 1771, that authority would prove lethal. Before we dive into the darkest banquet in royal history, hit that subscribe button. It helps us uncover more forgotten rulers whose vices destroyed them. Drop a comment telling me which historical figure you'd like us to expose next. Now, let's step back into that fatal February evening when a king's hunger finally consumed him. The transformation began the moment Adolf Frederick stepped into Stockholm's royal palace. Imagine ruling a kingdom where every decision requires parliamentary approval, not just laws or taxes, but who you can invite to dinner, which rooms you can redecorate, even which servants attend your private chambers. The Swedish Age of Liberty had turned their monarch into Europe's most expensive puppet. While other kings commanded armies, Adolf Frederick commanded only the royal kitchen staff. The Riksdag, Sweden's four-estate parliament, controlled his income, his schedule, his correspondence. He couldn't even travel outside Stockholm without written permission. But the kitchen remained his domain. Here, surrounded by roasting meats and imported delicacies, Adolf Frederick discovered the only power he could exercise without parliamentary oversight: the power to consume. What started as comfort eating slowly transformed into something darker, a systematic assertion of will through gluttony. Chroniclers noted his unusual appetite as early as 1755. While most nobles ate to sustain themselves, the king ate to dominate his environment. Every meal became a small rebellion against his powerlessness. By the 1760s, Adolf Frederick's eating habits had become legendary throughout European courts. Foreign ambassadors wrote detailed reports describing royal banquets that lasted 6 hours, where the king consumed quantities that would satisfy a dozen men. Dr. Hermann Schutzerkrantz, the royal physician, documented the king's declining health with clinical precision. Chronic headaches, digestive problems, hemorrhoids, and alternating constipation and diarrhea, all symptoms of systematic overeating. Yet Adolf Frederick refused to moderate his consumption. The most disturbing detail? He ate alone. While his guests observed polite portion control, the king gorged himself in full view of the court, as if demonstrating that gluttony was his sole remaining royal prerogative. Court records show he employed food tasters not for poison, a traditional royal concern, but to ensure every dish met his escalating standards for richness and excess. His favourite dishes included lobster swimming in butter, caviar by the spoonful, and multiple courses of cream-laden desserts, but nothing compared to his obsession with semla. Semla, those innocent-looking cream buns that would ultimately kill him, represented everything Adolf Frederick craved but couldn't control. Traditionally eaten only on Fat Tuesday before Lent, these pastries symbolised indulgence before sacrifice, pleasure before penance. For Adolf Frederick, semla became a year-round addiction. He ordered the royal pastry chefs to prepare them weekly, then daily, served floating in warm milk with cinnamon and sometimes drizzled with additional cream. What should have been a seasonal treat became his signature vice. Swedish tradition dictated eating perhaps 2 or 3 semla on Shrove Tuesday. Historical records show Adolf Frederick regularly consumed 8 to 10 in a single sitting, treating them like appetizers rather than desserts. The cream-filled buns became his edible crown jewels, the one luxury he could command without parliamentary approval. Kitchen staff later testified that preparing the king's semla required special protocols. Each bun had to be perfectly golden, filled with fresh almond paste and whipped cream, then floated in a specific temperature of milk. The king would inspect each serving personally, sending back any that didn't meet his exacting standards. By 1770, his semla consumption had become so notorious that foreign diplomats included descriptions in their reports home, treating the king's gluttony as a symbol of Sweden's political decay. While Adolf Frederick drowned his powerlessness in food, Sweden's political situation deteriorated rapidly. The Riksdag split into bitter factions, the Hats and Caps, who used the helpless king as a political football. Foreign powers subsidised different parties, essentially buying influence over Swedish policy, while the nominal monarch ate himself into irrelevance. In 1768, Adolf Frederick attempted one final assertion of royal authority. Guided by his son Gustav, he refused to sign certain parliamentary documents and formally threatened to abdicate. For a brief moment, it seemed like the monarchy might reclaim some dignity. But the crisis ended with compromise. The Riksdag increased his allowance, but maintained all constitutional restrictions. Adolf Frederick had gained nothing except confirmation of his irrelevance. Witnesses reported that immediately after this political humiliation, his eating became even more compulsive. The pattern was clear. Every loss of political control triggered greater culinary excess. Food became his substitute for power, appetite his only remaining form of royal assertion. By early 1771, even the king's most loyal courtiers recognised the warning signs. Dr. Schütze-Krantz privately documented what he called the king's declining vitality, noting that Adolf Frederick could barely walk upstairs without becoming winded, suffered constant digestive distress, and had developed a greyish complexion. More troubling were the psychological symptoms. The king became increasingly paranoid about his food, demanding that dishes be prepared exactly as specified, and becoming enraged when meals didn't meet his expectations. He began eating at odd hours, summoning kitchen staff at midnight for elaborate feasts. Foreign ambassadors noted his physical deterioration in diplomatic correspondence. The Prussian envoy described him as resembling a man drowning in his own excess, while the French diplomat wrote that His Majesty appears to be consuming himself from within. But the most chilling detail comes from Queen Louisa Ulrika's private letters. She wrote to her brother Frederick the Great, "My husband no longer rules Sweden. Sweden no longer rules my husband. Only his appetite commands, and I fear where it leads." As 1771 began, Adolf Frederick's eating reached truly dangerous levels. Kitchen records show he was consuming enough daily calories to sustain 3 adult men. His typical lunch included multiple meat courses, seafood, rich sauces, and invariably ended with several semla. Dr. Schütze-Krantz later testified that he repeatedly warned the king about the health consequences of his eating habits. Adolf Frederick's response was always the same: "In the kitchen, I am still king." The royal physician's notes from January 1771 paint a grim picture. His Majesty suffers from persistent headaches, violent stomach pains, irregular bowel movements, and what appears to be early signs of heart strain. His appetite remains disturbingly excessive, as if he seeks to fill some unfillable void through consumption alone. Palace staff reported increasingly bizarre behaviour. The king began timing his meals obsessively, eating certain foods in specific sequences, and becoming enraged when dishes arrived even minutes late. He started requiring that all food be served at precise temperatures, tested by servants before reaching his plate. February 12th, 1771, Shrove Tuesday, arrived with all the symbolism of a Greek tragedy. This was the traditional day of indulgence before Lent's 40 days of fasting, the last chance for gluttony before spiritual purification. For Adolf Frederick, it represented the ultimate test. Could he master his appetite for 40 days, or would his appetite finally master him? The day began normally enough. The king attended morning prayers, held brief court audiences, and complained about his usual political impotence. But by early afternoon, palace staff noticed his increasing agitation. Kitchen servants were summoned repeatedly to adjust menu preparations. The fatal meal was planned like a military campaign. Adolf Frederick personally selected each dish: lobster in clarified butter, spoonfuls of caviar, smoked kippers, sauerkraut with turnips, roasted duckling, and of course champagne to wash it all down. But the centerpiece, his final assertion of royal will, would be the semla. Not one or two as tradition demanded, not even the 8 or 10 he typically consumed. Tonight, on his last Fat Tuesday, Adolf Frederick ordered 14 servings of semla, each floating in its own bowl of hot milk, each a small act of rebellion against mortality itself. As evening shadows fell across the royal palace, the king sat down to eat himself to death. And this time, he would succeed. At exactly 6 o'clock on February 12, 1771, King Adolf Frederick entered the royal dining hall for what would be his final meal. The table groaned under the weight of his requested feast, a grotesque monument to unchecked appetite. Picture the scene: lobster claws arranged like weapons around silver platters, caviar glistening black as death, the sharp scent of vinegar from mountains of sauerkraut. Champagne bubbled in crystal glasses while roasted duckling sat in pools of its own fat. At the table's centre, like an altar to gluttony, 14 bowls of semla waited in perfect formation. Each semla floated in warm milk flavoured with cinnamon and raisins, the cream spilling out like wounds. Adolf Frederick surveyed his edible kingdom with the satisfaction of a general reviewing his troops before battle. For once, he commanded absolute authority. The king ate with methodical precision. First the lobster, cracking shells with his bare hands, sucking marrow from each claw, then spoonfuls of caviar, the salty eggs bursting against his teeth. The sauerkraut followed, its acidity cutting through the richness, while champagne washed each course down his increasingly strained throat. Servants later testified that he ate in complete silence, his focus absolute. No conversation, no acknowledgement of the attending staff, just the mechanical process of consumption elevated to ritual. The duckling disappeared piece by piece, skin crackling between his teeth, grease running down his chin, but the climax came with the semla. One by one, Adolf Frederick consumed all 14 pastries, not quickly, like a starving man, but deliberately, savouring each cream-filled bite as if it contained the essence of royal power itself. Witnesses described the horrifying precision with which he approached each bowl, spooning the milk-soaked buns into his mouth while staring directly ahead. By the 13th semla, palace staff could hear his laboured breathing. By the 14th, sweat beaded on his forehead despite the February cold. When he finally pushed back from the table, Adolf Frederick had consumed enough food to sustain a peasant family for a week. 3 hours later, the King of Sweden would be dead. The end came with shocking suddenness. At approximately 9 o'clock, while digesting his massive feast in the royal sitting room, Adolf Frederick suddenly doubled over in agony. Witnesses described his scream as unlike anything they'd ever heard. Not pain, but the sound of something fundamental breaking inside. Dr. Hermann Schütze-Krantz rushed to attend the king, finding him writhing on the floor, clutching his distended stomach. His face had turned an alarming shade of grey, and his breathing came in desperate gasps. The royal physician immediately recognised the symptoms: massive digestive failure leading to systemic collapse. His Majesty's stomach has quite simply burst from the strain, Schützenkrantz later wrote in his medical report. The quantity of food consumed exceeded all reasonable capacity. The digestive system, already weakened by years of abuse, simply could not process such excess. But the true horror lay in the king's consciousness. Adolf Frederick remained awake and aware as his body shut down around him. He tried to speak, to issue final commands, but could only produce weak gasps. His eyes, witnesses reported, showed not fear but a terrible understanding. He knew exactly what had killed him. The political implications struck everyone immediately. Sweden's king was dying not from poison, not from war, not from assassination, but from his own inability to control his appetite. It was the most pathetic royal death in European history. Count Johann Gabriel Oxenstierna, writing from Vienna a month later, captured the dark absurdity. His Majesty's death has occurred from indigestion of hetweg, sauerkraut, meat with turnips, lobster, caviar, duckling and champagne wine. He added bitterly that the pastry chef should be sent into exile for murdering the king. As Adolf Frederick's breathing grew shallower, the constitutional implications became clear. His son Gustav would inherit not just a throne, but a kingdom that had literally watched its monarch eat himself to death on live display. The Age of Liberty was ending not with political revolution, but with the grotesque spectacle of royal gluttony. At 9:15 in the evening, exactly 3 hours after finishing his 14th semla, King Adolf Frederick of Sweden drew his final breath. His last act on earth had been an assertion of the only power he possessed, the power to destroy himself through excess. The autopsy, performed 2 days later by Dr. Schützenkrantz, revealed the systematic damage decades of overeating had inflicted. The king's stomach had stretched to nearly 3 times normal size, his digestive tract showed extensive scarring, and his heart revealed clear signs of strain from carrying his excessive weight. But the most chilling discovery was how deliberately constructed this death had been. This wasn't accidental overeating. It was the culmination of a 20-year campaign of self-destruction through gluttony. Kitchen records showed Adolf Frederick had been steadily increasing his portion sizes, testing the limits of human consumption like a scientist studying his own mortality. Modern medical experts recognized the pattern. Adolf Frederick suffered from what we now understand as binge eating disorder, compounded by political trauma. Unable to control his kingdom, his parliament, or his own legacy, he redirected his need for dominance toward the one thing he could absolutely command: his appetite. The systematic nature becomes even more disturbing when you consider the timing. February 12th was Shrove Tuesday, the last day before Lent's 40-day fast. Adolf Frederick's final meal wasn't random excess. It was a calculated rebellion against spiritual discipline itself. He chose gluttony over salvation, appetite over abstinence, immediate pleasure over eternal reward. Contemporary observers understood the deeper implications. This wasn't just a king who ate too much. This was a monarch who transformed self-destruction into his final act of royal authority. When political power failed him, he asserted absolute control over his own demise. The Swedish court physician's final assessment read like an indictment. His Majesty consumed food as other kings consumed territories, relentlessly, systematically, without regard for consequence. In the end, he conquered only his own destruction. Adolf Frederick had achieved something unprecedented in royal history. He had become the first monarch to literally rule himself to death through appetite alone. His kingdom survived him, but the image of a king gorging himself into the grave would haunt Swedish memory for centuries. The question wasn't whether this death was avoidable, it was whether Adolf Frederick had planned it this way all along. The death sent shockwaves through European courts, but not for the reasons you might expect. Foreign ambassadors scrambled to report home not about succession crises or political instability, but about the sheer embarrassment of it all. How do you diplomatically explain that a king literally ate himself to death? Queen Louisa Ulrika, devastated but practical, immediately moved to control the narrative. Official announcements declared that Adolf Frederick had died suddenly of natural causes after dinner. The word stroke appeared in some documents, heart failure in others. No mention of the 14 semla, the systematic overeating, or the grotesque spectacle of royal gluttony. But the truth leaked out anyway. Count Oxenstierna's diary entry, written from Vienna, spread through diplomatic channels like wildfire. Within weeks, European courts were sharing the story in whispered conversations. The Swedish king who couldn't control his kingdom, so he destroyed himself with food instead. The timing proved catastrophic for Sweden's international reputation. This was the age of enlightenment, when monarchs were supposed to embody reason, restraint, and philosophical sophistication. Instead, Sweden's king had died demonstrating the most primitive form of self-destruction, death by gluttony. The political consequences came immediately. His 25-year-old son, Gustaf III, inherited not just a throne, but a monarchy humiliated by its previous occupants' public suicide through excess. The new king's first challenge wasn't foreign enemies or domestic rebellions. It was restoring dignity to a crown tarnished by his father's final, fatal feast. Adolf Frederick's death marked more than the end of one man's life. It signalled the death of Sweden's Age of Liberty. The parliamentary system that had reduced him to a powerless figurehead would soon face its own destruction. Gustaf III, witnessing how political impotence had literally killed his father, resolved never to accept such limitations. Within a year of inheriting the throne, he staged a military coup that ended parliamentary supremacy and restored royal authority. The Semla king's death became the catalyst for Sweden's return to absolutism. The psychological legacy proved even more disturbing. Adolf Frederick had demonstrated that when power is completely removed from a ruler, the human psyche finds other outlets for control, often destructive ones. His systematic self-destruction through food became a warning about the dangers of rendering any human being completely powerless. Modern historians recognise a darker pattern. Adolf Frederick wasn't unique. Throughout history, powerless rulers have found increasingly bizarre ways to assert control over their circumstances. Some turn to sexual excess, others to religious fanaticism, still others to artistic obsession. Adolf Frederick chose gluttony, and chose it so thoroughly that it killed him. The semla themselves became symbols of royal excess in Swedish culture. Even today, bakeries across Sweden sell them with knowing references to the king who ate himself to death. What should have been a simple seasonal pastry became a permanent reminder of how appetite, unchecked by wisdom or restraint, can destroy even the most privileged lives. The lesson wasn't just about overeating, it was about what happens when human beings substitute immediate pleasure for long-term purpose, when appetite becomes the only remaining form of personal authority. Here's what haunts me about Adolf Frederick's story. Was this really about food? Or was it about something far darker? When you strip away all political power from someone, when you reduce them to a ceremonial figurehead with no real authority, what happens to the human need for control? Look around today's world. How many people do you see using food, shopping, social media, or other consumption to fill the void where purpose should be? Are we all just potential Adolf Fredericks, waiting for our own 14 semla moment? What do you think? Drop your thoughts below.